Live, episode number 66. My name is Joza. I'm an author, speaker, executive coach, and a student. In this episode, I have the honor and privilege to talk to Patrice Bain, who foremost is an educator. But besides being an educator, she's a speaker, author, and a consultant. And she just recently authored an excellent book with her co-author, Pooja Agarwal. And the book's titled Powerful Teaching Unleash the Science of Learning. And what they did here was a lot of the science that these cognitive scientists have written about, have done research, and tested on college students had not really been tested at the classroom setting in elementary school level. And that's where Patrice collaborated with these cognitive scientists to test out what really works. And based on her findings with different strategies that they used, she writes about that with her co-author in this excellent book, Powerful Teaching. A little bit about Patrice. Now, she's got a long resume. She was a Fulbright scholar in Russia. She taught for 25 years elementary school students, and 12 of those she collaborated with cognitive scientists to come up with effective ways of making students learn, not just for short term, but for long term. That was their key focus. How do you make students retain that information? And we talk about that in this episode. And then most recently, as I mentioned, she authored this excellent book, Powerful Teaching. So in this episode, we talk about her teaching journey and what makes a teacher effective and which are some of these techniques that she found works. And one of the fundamental questions that I asked her is, how come students are not taught how to learn, which is so fundamental to our success? Then we talked about how can we apply some of the strategies in the workforce, because today companies have to be a learning organization. And then what can we individually do to become a lifelong learner, an effective lifelong learner? And then we ended with what are some of the things she does personally to learn. So you will enjoy this show. You will get a lot out of this show. So without much ado, let's just get to the show. Okay, Patrice, welcome to the show. It's really my honor and privilege to be talking to you today. And I'm really excited because I think what you do, teaching and learning, I believe are the two fundamental skills that we all have to learn right from the beginning till we get into old age. So, thank you for coming on the show. And I really want to thank you for the service that you've done for so many years teaching young students. It must have been pretty exciting. And I want to thank you for that because teaching is a very noble profession and you're one of the leading teachers in this country. So thank you from me and all the other students and parents who have really benefited. And now I think with the book that you've written, people like myself who did not have the opportunity to be one of your students, to get to be a student, reading the book and then talking to you. So thank you very much for everything you've done in the education field.
Thank you, Jay, for having me on. This is delightful. I'm really looking forward to talking with you today.
Great. So just to get started, can you talk about your teaching journey? How did you get into teaching? When did it start? And how did you know that this is something was your life calling?
Well, I probably came to it a little differently than most people. I never thought I wanted to be a teacher. In fact, I had an undergrad degree in something totally different, and I worked with special populations around the country, and I worked as a counselor at a program for adolescents and pediatrics who had experienced chemical dependency and depression issues. Most of the people that I worked with had made suicide attempts or were addicted to drugs. And I really connected with these students. And it got me thinking, of course, these people that I worked with, these children that I worked with, had families and important people. But what if they had a special teacher that helped them get through before they ever got to that point? What I did, I quit my job and I went back to school, and I knew that my calling was to become a teacher. And so that's what I did.
Great, great. And how did you then focus on that students that you were teaching, that some of them were not learning? When did you realize that you needed to really focus on making sure that the emphasis was more on, not only more, but emphasis had to be also not on just teaching, as you describe in your book. We focus on encoding. Maybe you can
Mm-hmm.
go into that in more detail. But it was these retrieval strategies that were very important in students learning, not only for short term, but for long term. When did you realize that it was these learning techniques that were critical in the students able to learn and think on their own and can retain that information after taking your class or other classes that they are taking in their academic years?
Well, that too, Jay, was a journey. The first of all, teaching is really difficult. There are so many demands put on teachers, and the time is something that I don't think most people realize. And so my first several years were just simply trying to figure it all out. How do I get the lesson plans done and cover the curriculum and everything that needed to be done? And so I had been teaching for several years before I started realizing that I I need to question some things. Why are some students learning really well and others aren't? What is that disconnect? And it was about this time that I met two really wonderful cognitive scientists, Mark McDaniel and Henry Roediger III, who are cognitive scientists from Washington University here in St. Louis. And they wanted to research how students learn in authentic classrooms, because up until that time, most of the research that had been done on learning had been done at universities in laboratories with college students. And so Dr. Roediger and Dr. McDaniel obtained a large grant from IES, which is the Institute of Education Science, for the purpose of researching how students learn. And the authentic classroom that they chose was mine. And so I was really able to be kind of at the forefront of, of how learning takes place. And the cognitive scientist who came to work with me in my classroom then was Pooja Agarwal, the co-author of my book. And we started looking at how students learn and strategies that help them. And I worked for years with these cognitive scientists, and it was really being able to learn myself how my students learn, because that's not taught in teacher ed programs. And so it really had been this long journey. I taught for over 25 years. And it probably took a good 15 years before I was able to really start perfecting my craft and perfecting and creating the strategies based on cognitive science.
Excellent. So when you started teaching, this was just your class where you were using these strategies. So you must have gotten support from the administration in teaching these kids on how to learn. Is that correct?
It is. In fact, it was It was a bit of a challenge at first to get the approval from my administration because this had never been done before. And so some of the guidelines were that I was to be able to continue my teaching as I always had, that I would be the one in charge of the teaching in my class, not the research study. And I totally remember a conversation I had with my superintendent who said, Patrice, why do you want this? Why do you want this research in your classroom? And I remember saying, because I want to know why my students learn. And this is a great way to do it. So with a wonderful approval from admin, we started.
Great. Yeah, because that is so key. Because I was reading that book. I mean, you know about the famous teacher Jaime Escalante. They even made a movie, Stand and Deliver. And one of the things he mentions in one of his books is that he would not have been successful teaching advanced for AP Calculus if it wasn't for the principal's support that he got. So that's pretty important to have that. Without that support, it's very hard to succeed. The question I have is, why do you think, because I don't remember ever, I mean, I went, undergraduate, graduate, and throughout the schooling, I never ever learned how to learn. Why do you think that is the case? When you think that that should be so fundamental right from kindergarten all the way up as long as you're in school and even after. But I don't remember now. It seems like there's a lot of material on internet, and there are courses on MOOC. Barbara Oakley has one of the most popular MOOC courses called
Oh,
How to
isn't
Learn.
she amazing?
Oh, she's just amazing. You just want to learn every time you watch her. And she's also like
Yes.
you, trying to get that message out how important learning is. And there are a lot of new books that are coming out on learning. So learning is really, there's a lot of focus on how important learning is. But the thing is that you're not learning that in school. And why do you think that is the case? And what is that changing based on your knowledge on what's going on with schools?
That is such a good point, Jay. In fact, I was never taught how to learn. Through all my teacher education program classes, never once did we talk about actually how students learn. And it was not until this research started in my classroom that I fully started to comprehend, why do we keep this from our students? Why is this not taught? And so part of my mission, my mountaintop, is to really try to work with teachers in promoting how to teach students how to learn. Because I agree with you, this is absolutely fundamental. And what I found when I taught my students how to learn, they felt so good in knowing. It's like it's not a big secret. They were able to learn how to learn. And with my sixth graders, too often some of them had internalized failure, thinking, I'm just not smart. When that had nothing, that was far from the truth. Because once they learned how to learn, they did wonderfully. They got excellent grades and could rattle off important information and deep thinking on essays. And so when I think of so many of the problems that affect students these days, so often it is because of this internalized failure. And why don't we simply teach them how to learn?
Right. So it seems like you're empowering them so that they feel like
Exactly.
they're in control, and also they're confident. And those
Yes.
three things, I think, make a huge difference. Just a
Yes.
personal question. Since you've been teaching for 25 years, what do you think makes because teaching, as you mentioned earlier, is a really hard profession because you're
Mhm.
constantly being measured and you're kind of measuring yourself because you want to make sure that whatever you're teaching, the students are learning. And also you feel like if they're not learning, then maybe you're doing something wrong. So my question is, what do you think makes somebody like yourself an outstanding teacher?
Well, that's very kind of you to say, Jay. Um, there are so many outstanding teachers, and there are just so many things involved. One is I think having compassion. One is being able to have the knowledge of the science of learning. That should be forefront. You need to have a great understanding of your curriculum, and and all of these things come together, and it's really hard to start out at that level. So to me, being able as a novice teacher to have mentors, to have a supportive administration, to have people in your court that can help guide you along the way. And that's what really makes great teachers.
Right, right. And what do you do right now? Because obviously you want to keep on improving. What are some of the things that you do right now to get better at what you're doing? I mean, you've obviously been teaching for 25 years. You've written a book, and you've had tremendous success with the students that you have taught. But I'm sure you still are looking to saying, look, what can I do better so I can reach those kids who are not reachable and get them develop, have them develop that passion for learning. So what are some of the things that you're currently doing that I mean, you mentioned about the research and working with this cognitive scientist, but I just wanted to kind of get your take on that, because once you reach a certain point, you're like saying, I'm now at the top, I don't need to learn anything. But obviously learning is very important. Otherwise you won't be that effective as a teacher. So I just want to kind of find out from you, what do you do right now to get better at teaching?
Oh, I I will be a lifelong learner until my last breath. That's You can't stop learning. And the more you know, the more you want to learn. And so I know my metacognition, I know what I know, but being able to follow my Twitter heroes, my cognitive scientist heroes. I keep learning. Every day I am reading books. I am reading blogs. I'm listening to podcasts, and what I love is being involved in these kinds of communities. They will validate what what you know, but also expand to help you learn more.
Hmm.
That's what I do.
Excellent, excellent. Is learning comes down to, teacher of course can only do so much because you got a big class and you got multiple classes that you're teaching, and also you're trying to empower the students. What role do parents have when it comes to, especially when the children, when they're children, what role do you see parents playing in helping them learn? Like, do you get a lot of parents asking you, Patrice or Mrs. Bain, what can I do at home? Obviously, you will have my child for 1 hour or so, and then he's with his or her friends. But then most of the time he's at home. What can I do at home? Not to duplicate you, try to be like, but what are some of the things that we can do at home so that they maintain that passion for learning, or so that it reinforces what you're teaching them in class? What kind of questions do you get from parents, and what kind of success you've seen when they get involved with their children in fostering learning?
First of all, I think parents are the most important teachers. Uh, they are with children from birth They are the ones that provide the environments. And so I've always thought of learning as a triangle, that the student, the teacher, but also the parent, we are all in that triangle together. I did a national survey and I asked parents, what would you most like to learn from your teacher? And 87% replied that they want to know how their children learn. So, when you think of us as being in the profession, and we are now just really getting the science of learning, parents have not been exposed to that either. And so it is so important to bring parents along with that. There are many ways to do it. I would do it in parent conferences, at open houses, PTA meetings, parent seminars. And I would also, when I teach the students how to learn, I would encourage them, go home and tell your parents about this. And it really became a great partnership between the student, the parent, and myself. And a question that you brought up, so often parents aren't really sure how to help their child. Do they totally let the child do it on their own? Do they help too much? And so by providing a partnership, it really aids what and how the child learns. When I talk with parents, I give them strategies that they can use at home, how to use retrieval, how to just, when you're in the car or at dinner, simple strategies that will be increasing the learning for their child.
Right. So there's something I had to share with you. So I had two children. I did not do this with my daughter, but I definitely did with my son since he was having some difficulty in school. And I remember, and I'm not sure if this made the difference, but it kind of something you talk about in your book, but it was a little different. At that time, I had the opportunity to read your book. So I did something I called it 220. And it's minutes, 2 minutes and 20 minutes. So every morning I would spend 2 minutes with him. It was difficult. As you can see, kids don't want to spend that much time with you in the morning. So 2 minutes just saying, what is the purpose of that what are you planning to learn today? Just get him to talk. Like what other things, just basic stuff, just for 2 minutes, because that's all the time I had. But then when he got home after he refreshed and had something to eat, I would give him 20 minutes to just tell me his entire day. And I believe I never actually had to work with him, but after I started doing it, he pretty much was on his own. Since then, I never had to work with him with education. And prior to that, I would spend so much time going through each subject. Let's go through this. Let's go through this. And it got to be so overwhelming. I said, I'm not a teacher. There's got to be a better way to do this. Mm-hmm. And just getting him to talk about his day, and it kind of ties into what you talk about in the book. What I didn't do is I should have asked him, what did you learn yesterday, as you talk about? But I didn't know that. I said, if you can just tell me what your day was like after you had some time to kind of decompress and just tell me. And then I would give him 20 minutes without any interruption. And after he was done, I said, well, if you need any help, I'm around. And that was it. And
Jay, I love that. In fact, do you mind if I steal it and use it in some of my presentations?
Yeah, sure.
220. Sure. That is a wonderful idea. You are setting your child up in the morning to start thinking ahead. That's wonderful. But that 20 minutes, you are offering chances for retrieval where your child is going through the day and pulling back this information, pulling out this information that is so valuable. To do that before he or she actually begins doing the homework, You are pulling out some of the things that they learned and putting it into the working memory, which is going to aid them as they are doing whatever work they have assigned. So that's brilliant. Good job.
Right. It was difficult. I'm not saying it
Oh,
in the beginning. I don't think it. I mean, I wasn't keeping a watch or time clock or anything to see how much. But I said you get 20 minutes, and I won't interrupt you. And that's the key thing. You can't interrupt them. Let them just keep talking. And the thing is that there are some other skills that he was also developing, communication, that how can he take all that information, synthesize it, and communicate it so he can cover all the classes. And the thing is that once he started doing that, he knew, it comes back to what you talk about in your book, metacognition, what he knew and what he didn't know. And
yes.
once he knew that, I didn't have to really do much with him. He was able to figure it out on his own. I have one other question, and this has to do with students. I don't know if you ever did this, because one of the things that I remember from school is that, when people get good grades and they do well on tests, and kids who don't do well on tests, they feel like, oh, he's smart and I'm not.
Mhm.
So did you ever do this? Have the kids, the students that did well, have them talk about what they did and what strategies they used to prepare that got him the good grade, so that the students are learning from other students saying, hey, he spent so much time and he used these strategies and I didn't use any of those strategies. So now I know, maybe I'm not, maybe I'm not that dumb. I didn't put in the time or the strategies that these kids who got better grades. And if I did that, maybe I can get the same grades that they did. So they don't feel like that, they don't think like they are just dumb, but they just don't know that these other kids are doing. And by having them talk about it, they can learn from them. And also the kids who are do talking to them, they can learn more just by teaching the other kids on how they can get better. Because a lot of times what happens in our school is we tend to pit kids against, we have gifted programs and this program and that program. And what I notice is some of these countries that outperform United States in tests, especially Finland, they don't have a gifted program. What they do is when kids who are really motivated, advanced, then they become kind of like the teachers for other kids. And that's what like lifts these other kids up, saying, hey, I'm learning directly from my peer on what I have to do. And if they're putting this much amount of time and they're using this type of retrieval techniques or strategy, spaced interleaving and feedback driven metacognition, maybe I should do that. Then I'll know exactly what I'm not doing well that these kids who are doing well are doing. Is that something you ever did in your classes, to get the students to teach other students on how they can be like them?
Yes and no.
Mhm.
Yes, in that I believed in, I would not have students like work directly with another student, but what I would do would be to have, I would ask what strategies people use to the class as a whole. And then we would talk about the strategies and how they were helpful. Sometimes it was me as a think aloud. Sometimes it was, I would ask students, and it didn't really matter what their grades were. I just wanted to know the different strategies that the students used. And by doing it in a whole group, it would it would create a really good conversation.
Mhm.
And then after we had exams, I would ask students to write down what strategies did you use, which strategies did you find most effective. And then that would lead again to other class discussions.
Mhm.
So rather than having a top grade versus a lower grade student conversing, because I didn't want that kind of competition.
Right.
I had an environment where everybody participated.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why I like that is because, again, it didn't matter what the highest grades that you were getting, but no matter where you were on the spectrum, you may hear about a strategy that you had never used before.
Right.
And it didn't matter, you know, what your grades were. You may have been a top student, but you hear somebody else say, oh, well, I didn't try, I'm going to try that one. So I really am, I like the discussions, but I tend to prefer a whole group talking about them.
Right, right, right. Do you think in order to be a good teacher, now again, when I say teacher, I don't necessarily mean schools, lifelong, whether it's at work, on your own, that to be an effective teacher, you also have to be an effective learner?
That is a really good question. In fact, if there's any cognitive scientists out there, that would be a good question to research. I am not sure. I know it has helped me to be a better teacher by concentrating on learning. I'm not sure of the answer on that, Jay.
Right. The reason I asked that question is, yeah, the reason I asked that question is that you always hear from authors. They always say that if you want to be a good writer, you have to be a good reader. So that's where I'm getting that question from. That because they're kind of related. Because if you're not knowing how to, like, for example, let's say you're teaching, if you can't show the students, like, well, look, I'm learning how to play a guitar, and here's what I'm doing. But the same thing you can do with this topic that I'm teaching you. And I know the difficulty that you're going to go through, because other problem you have is you become an expert in what you do and the content that you're teaching, but you don't realize the difficulty you had because now you already know it so well, but you're not starting from scratch learning something new. And you tend to forget that the kids that you're teaching them, they're starting from ground zero, trying to learn this new topic, that if you can't relate to it, then maybe you may not be that effective in teaching them and what they're relate to what they're going through when you're teaching them something.
One of the reasons why I'm hesitating a little bit on this is because I'm able to go into school districts and work with entire districts, or I present at conferences where I will have teachers from various schools coming in. And I've had some really excellent teachers come up to me and say, why have I never learned this before? Why have I never heard this before? And so I think there are really good teachers that simply have not been exposed to the science of learning. But once they are, it validates that's why my students learn. So I think I know there are wonderful teachers out there who just have not yet been exposed to the science of learning, but they're still great teachers. They just maybe haven't learned the science behind it or why what they're doing is so successful.
Right. We may switch gears, talk about the science. We'll talk about this excellent book that you and Pooja have written for Powerful Teaching. Why did you write this book, and who's the main audience you're targeting? Because when I read it, even though I'm not sure I was the right audience for it, but I got a lot out of the book. So I just wanted to find out, when you wrote the book, what made you saying, okay, at this point now I've worked with the cognitive scientist, I've taught these students and used my classroom as a laboratory. it's now time for me to document this to reach a much broader audience. When did you decide to do that, and who were you targeting when you wrote this book?
Another great question, Jay. I probably around my 20th year of teaching, I would have such wonderful experiences of teaching students how to learn and being able to stand in my class and see their eyes just get so big with excitement because they were getting it. They knew how to learn. And I had probably around 180 students every day.
Wow.
And I knew that I was reaching those 180 students. But I wanted more. I started thinking, okay, every year I will have another 180 students, but I want other teachers to experience what I experience, when to see the light bulbs go off and how students who internalized failure become such successful learners. And this idea of a book just started building and building. And I knew that because teaching takes about 70 hours a week,
Mm-hmm.
I knew I couldn't do both at the same time and do them justice. So after 25 years, I left teaching in order to write the book. So the book came out in June, and I had spent the previous year uh, writing it with Pooja Agarwal, 6 months of probably about 50 hours a week writing. And it was just a year ago, this past week, that we submitted the manuscript. So I knew this book was brewing, and I knew when the time was right for me to be able to really concentrate on writing it. I wanted this information out for teachers. I wanted it out for parents. I just, like I said earlier, I felt that I just needed to shout from a mountaintop that this works.
Mm-hmm.
And the book became a mountaintop.
Right, right. No, it does work, and you and Pooja have done an excellent job with this book.
Thank you.
I recommend it to anybody that, especially, I mean, I recommend it to everybody, but especially parents who have young children. I said,
Mm-hmm.
get this book, study it, read it every day, like it's a religious book,
Oh,
because
thank you.
because it's, well, I mean, there's a reason for it. It's so important to get the kids learning right, learning well right from the beginning, because
Yes.
otherwise, what the book is teaching is developing some excellent learning habits. And
Mm-hmm.
most of the time, you are kind of metric driven, which is, oh, what do I need to do to get a good grade? You may achieve that, but now you're not really learning. You're not becoming a
Yes.
lifelong learner. And
Yes.
what you and Pooja are teaching in the book is de-emphasizing that aspect of learning. That's what everybody focuses on, because there's that metric out there that if I get good grade, there's that signaling that is so important for my success. But then they lose the passion for learning, and learning becomes like a chore, like, oh, I got to learn this thing. Where what you're trying to do in this book is that learning should be fun, that you should develop that passion for learning. And that's why I recommend that book, that you do that so well in saying, look, there's not just one strategy. There are multiple strategies that you can use. Pick the one you like. But
Exactly.
definitely the main thing is that these things are all tested. Maybe I should let you talk about this, that these things are all tested. Do you want to talk a little bit about, because you don't focus much on it, the three stages of learning, and the book focuses primarily on the retrieval part, but can you just kind of briefly talk about the three stages of learning? That, because I didn't know that, but after reading it, it made a lot of sense to me.
Yes. So there are three main stages of learning. The first one is encoding. And as teachers, that's what we do. Encoding is where we impart knowledge. So it could be, teacher driven or reading a book or whatever. Encoding is getting the information out. And the second step is storage. And often as teachers, that's pretty much where we've been taught that our job is to get the information out. And once it's in our students' heads, good, we've done our job. But it's so much more important rather than concentrating on putting the information in. And Pooja Agarwal has a wonderful quote that let's instead focus on pulling that information out. And it's that third step, retrieval, that is so often missed. And so the 3 stages, encoding is getting the information out, storage where it's in, but that third, all important, is let's pull that information out because that's learning. And too often, that third step is missed. And I realized that in my own classroom when I realized that my students had really mastered doing homework, that they knew how to read a question and look up an answer and write it down, repeat, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they weren't retrieving the information. And I found that students who had mastered homework were getting really good grades, but they couldn't discuss it. There was no critical thinking behind it. And once I realized that third all important step, I totally switched the way I taught to make sure that retrieval was a part of every step of the learning in my classroom.
Right. No, that makes sense. But let me get back to the first one, encoding. Like we always think about these teachers that had impact on us, right? And you always find out it's the way they taught the course. They made the course come alive. And because I would guess that's encoding, the way they presented the material, that made it easier for you to remember it and also to retrieve it. So let me make sure I understand correctly. Of course, I agree that retrieval is very important, but how important is encoding as far as the way teachers make their material fun, exciting, and memorable so that the students say, wow, I remember it the way Mrs. Bain taught that class, the way she brought Lady Murasaki Shibuko come alive, right? And I'll remember that for a long time, the way she mimicked Lady Shibuki and all that. So how important is it the way a teacher encodes that information to make it easier for students to store it and then retrieve it later on?
Well, part of that is my style. I love to use a lot of energy and storytelling in my classroom. But that's not a comfort level for all teachers. So the way I taught might be memorable, using a lot of energy and storytelling, but I don't want that to take away from teachers who have different styles of teaching, who also make it very memorable. And so I think the important part is encoding the information, but allowing the connections to be made with the information so that the students can later recall it. A danger that I think all teachers need to be aware of is, excuse me, something that Jennifer Gonzalez talked about in Grecian urns. And the story was that students were learning about ancient Greece, and had a wonderful time using paper mache, I think, and creating these Grecian urns, which was very memorable. And the students loved it. But what did they learn? So I think as teachers, we need to be really careful that we aren't just making things fun and memorable without the learning.
Right.
So I think learning is key. If you have a way of presenting learning that is fun, great, but it doesn't have to be fun. But students do have to be able to retrieve information.
Right. Yeah, because I was more looking at it from like when you give talks, like you give a lot of talks, right? Because you want to make sure that you only get one shot. The audience that that you're talking to, that how do you make that come alive so that they can remember a lot of it after your talk is finished. But anyway, I don't want to say something about that because that's what I do. I give a lot of talks, and one of the challenges that I always face is how do I make my material come alive so that it's not only I'm teaching them, but teaching them in an entertaining way, so that they not only will pay attention, but remember the main idea and some of it afterwards. And that's hard. Most of the time, we don't really remember much after we listen to a talk.
Again, I think one of the most important things is, and we use this in our book, both Pooja and I use it in our talks, you be you.
Mm-hmm.
You, when you're speaking, you have a message to give. And I think one of the most important things is to be genuine, to be you, and come up with ways to connect to your audience. And then again, have them retrieve that information. When I give my workshops, I practice what I preach. And so I use retrieval throughout the entire presentation. You focus, it's a lot like teaching. You know what your end goal is in teaching. You know what your essential question or what your essay or you start at the end. You know what you want your students or your audience to take away. And then you incorporate that within your talk or within your lesson or within your lecture. And then you just make sure that you are providing the opportunities for your students or your audience to be able to go back and retrieve that.
Mm-hmm. Right. Patrice, to change gears, learning at work, because a lot of people, like parents especially, they probably are interested, like, oh, this is great for my students, but how do I use some of this at work? And have you been approached by companies and saying, Patrice, for us to compete, our employees not only have to be good teachers, but they also have to be good learners. And two of the positions that most companies don't have, which they should have, is a chief teaching officer and a chief learning officer. They don't seem to have that. They leave it up to the CEOs to figure all of that out, and then they end up spending ridiculous amount of money, and it has very little effect. That's what the research shows. So do you have any thoughts on how companies can use what you're teaching in your book and apply it in their corporate environment? Have you talked to corporations or people in that environment, and what kind of feedback are you getting from them?
Well, first of all, thank you, Jay. I have not been approached by any company, so please be sure and share my information.
Well, here's your chance. Here's your chance to let the corporations know that if they're not letting you come, if they're not having you coming in, they're essentially losing money, and now that'll get them to pay attention. So show them how they can make money by having you come in and talk to their employees.
I can do that.
Here's your chance.
But that really is a really important question, because the learning sciences, retrieval, the interleaving, spacing, metacognition, these are all things that are now used in engineering programs, in medical schools. And when you think, it's because students in these high stakes programs need to be able to retain so much information. You know, if you're in an ER, you can't just go Google something, right? You need to be able to have that information stored that you can pull out. Well, when you think of corporations, I can think of so many instances where this would be so valuable, where your people, your staff really need to be able to think on their feet and be able to pull forth information. So I hadn't really thought about it this way until you asked this question, Jay. But this would be vital training for corporations. You want your employees to have a command of whatever knowledge your company has mastered. And so to be able to offer trainings to your employees based on the science of learning, that's going to help them be able to retain and retrieve that all important third step of learning, to be able to pull that information out, really is valuable. So I think you're really onto something.
Right. And the reason I bring this up is because I give talks, and when you're giving talks, as you are, you got to know a lot, because you can't just flip one PowerPoint after another. You're going to just lose your audience. So that requires that I have to learn the material real well. And I used, of course, I didn't read your book, but I did. It seems like I was using many of the techniques you talk about, the retrieval practice, spacing, interleaving, and also feedback-driven metacognition. So I have to know, like say a talk is about, typically my talks run close to an hour. I have to give that talk without any real notes. So that means I have to really remember a lot. And in order to pull that off, I have to really practice all that. So I do spacing, as you talk about in your book. So I was spacing. I wasn't just, I was doing one day, come in morning, then next day. So there's a space. It's much shorter time because I was getting ready to give my talk. But there's something else that I did, which was also very interesting. And this is something people in corporations don't do that. It's interleaving. I basically take my talk and chunk it into 3-minute parts. And then I basically will have a card like this, and randomly, I think something you talk about in your book, I will come up with a card and say, okay, the way I've chunked it, talk about this. And then I would just videotape myself and give that talk. So now I'm interleaving. I'm not just saying, okay, let me just practice the intro. Let me just practice the intro repeatedly. Like you say, that's not that effective. And let me just practice the ending. That's not effective. So I randomly like mixed up the card, and whatever comes up, I will now give that talk. And
Excellent.
from that, so I'm a student. So yeah, that's why. And from that, I'm also, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm also using metacognition, because now I know what I'm able to communicate and what I'm not able to communicate well. And then I just basically put it all together, and I'm able to deliver my speech, and I videotape it. I have a professional videographer come in and videotape it, and then I'll review it to see, did I hit the mark or not? So that is something that corporations can easily do. But again, I have to tell you, that's a lot of work.
It is. It is. But don't you want a polished product?
Right, right.
And whether it is a teacher in front of a class, or a speaker giving a presentation, or an employee at a company, work goes into it in order to have your polished product. And I guess that's just a key across the board. But these steps will definitely help you get to that end point.
What I found, Patrice, it's very difficult for people to do this because after I give my talk, and many of these talks that I give are people who are looking for a good job. And I said, all I want you to do is record a 3-minute video with your message, your narrative, etc. The skill set. And I call this 0 to 1 because the percentage of people who actually will do that ranges from 0% to 1%. It's extremely difficult. For us, it may not be because we are really passionate about learning and we know these strategies. But what I found is for many people, it's extremely difficult. And especially as you get older, you develop all these bad habits and it's very hard to change it. So I'm sure that's why I wanted to kind of get your take on it. So let's change gears and now learning on your own. When somebody is reading a book, how should they go about reading a book so that they're learning and also retaining, that they're able to learn from that book? What kind of suggestions do you have for, let's say for myself, when I'm reading your book? How should I read your book so I can learn from your book?
There are some really valuable tips that will help you. One is simply after you've read, and again, it depends on how intense the subject is, the age level of the person who is reading. But just stop, put the book down. And either, as a student, write down what you most remember because you're retrieving. If for you, Jay, you could write it down or simply just stop and reflect. What were the most important takeaways from what I just read? And just ponder that for a little bit, because what you're doing is you are cementing that knowledge. You're creating the pathway for that knowledge in your head. And then go back to reading again. And then stop, pause, and again, reflect on what you just learned. Those are such effective ways. When you are giving your talk or when a teacher is giving a lecture, again, one of the most important things is the same principle. Stop, pause. Because too many times people are so busy trying to take notes during talking, right? Mm-hmm. And what you end up getting is jumble. And you never quite know if you got the most important aspects. Right. And so even as a lecturer, to pause, ask a question, let them reflect, whether to somebody next to them or to write it down or simply to ponder, and then go back. Mm-hmm. And you are creating a situation that is going to help them remember and retain and retrieve this information.
Right. So you suggest that before even, let's say if I wanted to read your book, I should already have a strategy written down or something before even tackling the book. So I can then follow that strategy as I'm reading that book.
It would help.
Right.
Unfortunately, probably a lot of people who haven't read the book wouldn't know those strategies yet.
Right.
So, as you're reading the book and you're learning, then go ahead. For example, in our book, again, we practice what we preach. We've put in several what we call power-ups, right, which follow the very essence of that stop, pause, retrieve. Sure. We have a do-it-yourself guide at the end of the book. So as people read the book, they can go back, or after you finish the book, go back and do that guide. But these are all techniques that we've incorporated in the book, right, that will help.
Yeah. So what I was doing is I was cheating when I was reading your book. and then I hit page 176, and I had to completely stop when you suddenly ask, like, do you know all these things, two up, and all the different strategies that you had talked about previously? And that's when I realized that I didn't read this book that well. and typically the way I read books is I'll do a first pass real fast, like I'll skim the book to just get an idea what the book is all about. Then the second time I will go in and read it in depth and highlight stuff. And the third time I will just look at the stuff that I've highlighted and try to internalize it. So, but that's when I realized, I said, these people were really smart when they wrote the book. They're going to keep us honest. And then I hit that page 176. I remember it. I said, they got me now. they got me. So
we didn't get you, Jay. You simply had an opportunity to test your metacognition.
That's right. But you were very clever. You're just like saying, okay, they got this power up, and now it comes at the end of the chapter too. I forgot what chapter it was. I want to get your thoughts on it. What do you think about technology? Are you an advocate of technology, or again, it depends on how you use technology to enhance learning? What are your thoughts on that?
It's how you use it. Technology is a wonderful tool when used appropriately. If you use technology as a way to simply look up something on Google and then write it down and you're not retrieving, no, that is not a good use of technology. But if you are able to incorporate technology into what you're doing, where you are still allowing students the chance to retrieve, to space, to interleave, to test their metacognition, whether they know it or not, then it can be very valuable. But I think teachers need to take a look. There's so much technology available.
Mm-hmm.
Does it really meet the purpose of learning? Or is it a flashy, get their attention, but doesn't support learning? So I think as educators and as parents, we need to take a better look at really what is the technology helping us? How is it helping us?
Right, and you probably heard about this, that many of the the entrepreneurs out of Silicon Valley, they don't use a lot of technology. They send the students to schools where they don't use a lot of technology that other schools tend to use. So it's kind of interesting that here these people in the forefront of technology, but when it comes to their children, they don't actually want their kids to be using technology. So I thought it was kind of interesting.
Yeah, I've read that too. It was eye-opening for me. If those who know technology best guard it for their children, I think that's a lesson for all of us.
Right. We're almost getting to the end. I have a few more questions. In talking to other teachers from other countries, what are you learning from them as far as what are they doing that is effective?
I am not an expert on what is happening in other countries, but I know Finland and Japan and Russia is really coming up, and UK. Their scores are always really wonderful. Their methods seem to be different from what ours are. I know there are some places where they have school 6 days a week, where education is real high priority. I mean, top priority in families. And so I think there's things that we can learn from other countries, but I also know that there are improvements that we now know that we can make within the United States. And one of them is definitely helping our teachers teach students how to learn, and being able to have in our classes spacing and retrieval and those very important principles that by doing that, we get our students to a deeper level of understanding with critical thinking. And to me, in the last 10 or 15 years, we've kind of been missing that. There's been so much importance placed on standardized testing and uh, homework and not so much thinking. And I think that is something that we in our country can start making that shift
Hmm.
into really understanding the three stages of learning and incorporating how kids learn into our classrooms. That's what we need to do here.
Right, right. So what you're saying is mm, empower the teachers, invest in teachers so that they can then teach these students on how to learn so that they become an independent learner. Because one of the
Yes.
things that I see is like with the technology advancement, we have to learn fast and well. And that means that at some point, we all going to have to become independent learners. And
Mhm.
that starts at an early age so that kids can learn from experts like teachers like you, so that when they get older, go to high school, they can start learning on their own and become independent
Yes.
as they go to
Yes.
colleges. This conventional way of learning may not suit us well for the future.
I'm sorry,
So
what was your
oh, yeah, no, I'm saying the way we're learning, the conventional way, the
oh
way we're learning may not be effective as our economy and the technology that's coming in, like machine learning, automation, that we're going to have to learn things fast and well. And also, it can't be too expensive because one of the biggest problem is that going to college is so expensive that people go into this
mhm.
huge debt. So this has to get figured out, and the emphasis seems to be on education but not on learning. Learning is where the emphasis should be. And you know,
Exactly.
one of the things I forgot to mention, like the reason that I was so much excited to talk to you is that I coach people, and a lot of the people are want to get new jobs. They want to get different kind of jobs that pay well, and I also
Mhm.
coach a lot of military veterans. And in order to get a good, high-paying job, you need skills. But in order to develop skills, you need to know how to learn in order to develop skills. So it all comes down to what you write about in your book, that if you can't learn well, then you can't develop skills that are marketable, that will get you a good high paying job that we all want, and keep that job so that you can continue to develop those skills. So this becomes very fundamental to everything, essentially, right?
I agree.
One last question. Just how do you personally learn? Are you use? Do you use all the techniques you do, or what is your favorite techniques that you use when you have to learn something new? And maybe you can give an example of something that you have learned recently, where you actually applied many of the strategies that you talk about in your book.
Well, Jay, for me, probably the most important is retrieval. Being bombarded with so much information as we all are, right? How how can I remember? And 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 so for me, the most important is retrieval. I am a classic case of getting something into my head, storing, and never being able to find it again. you know, where did it go? But I know when there's something that I want to remember, whether it's somebody's name, whether it's a technique, whether it's talking with you today, I know that I'm going to be retrieving that. I will purposefully, after I've learned it, a half hour later, I'm going to bring it back. I'm going to retrieve it again. And later that day, I'm going to retrieve it again. It takes what, 5 seconds? And the next day, I will go back and I will retrieve it again. And so I know that what works for me
Right.
is purposeful retrieval, because I know that is how it's going to stick
Mhm.
in my head.
Right, right, right. Oh no, that's exactly what I do. One of the things that I do, maybe you might be doing the same thing. I carry my little audio recorder with me.
Ah,
So every morning I go for a walk. So everything that I've learned, I will like record it. That's your retrieval
ah,
practice, right? And then I'll listen to it,
exactly.
and that I guess would be uh, feedback-driven metacognition, where I can then see how much did I retain and how much do I know and how much I don't know. So then I can then tweak it and learn more that I need to, and then again I'll record it, and that's how I learn. So that's one of the techniques that I use.
Excellent. Maybe I need to invest in one of those.
I think this is my best investment. I fill it up pretty quickly. Patrice, let me thank you very much. If somebody wants to get in touch with you, because you have a lot of information that's available on different websites, maybe you can. I'll include this in the show notes with links and everything so they can get to it. But if somebody wants to get in touch with you, whether it's corporations or schools, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
A great way is through my email, which is patrice@patricebain.com. You can also get information from our book at powerfulteaching.org. In fact, many of the strategies that we talk about in the book, we have go to resources and you can download all the templates for free. I would also recommend Pooja Agarwal has a wonderful site at retrievalpractice.org. She sends out weekly strategies for teachers. She has over 10,000 teachers checking this every week. It's another wonderful resource. Follow me on Twitter. I'm at Patrice Bain 1. So all of these would be great ways to get in touch with me and do. I would
Yes,
like that.
yes, and then you're very generous with your time, and I really appreciate it. I think I learned a lot talking to you, and I'm even more motivated to learn and come up with some new techniques to not only apply using myself, but also to share it with other people. Like I said, this is something that really works for me. And also the other thing that works for me is that if I learn something, I will write a blog post. And once I write a blog post, then I will video record it. So here's another thing. This this show, I'm going to learn a lot because I'm going to go through this entire show and then take out shortcuts. I'll take 5 questions and create shortcuts, and then also write about it and create a blog post out of it. So I'm going to learn a lot from talking to you today.
You're going to be the master.
Yes, and I don't mind being a master because learning is something you do want to master, right?
Right.
So, Patrice, are there any other questions or anything that you wanted to cover before we end the show?
Jay, I just want to thank you. What a wonderful invitation this was. I really enjoyed talking with you. Thank you for everything that you're doing with the veterans and for helping people get jobs. It's, you know, we all have our specialties, and when we can work together on helping people, it just makes the world such a better place. So thank you for everything you're doing.
Right, and let me thank you for your generosity and coming on the show and talking about your teaching experience and different ways that students can learn. Not students, we're all students at the end. So I really want to thank you for everything you've done and you're continuing doing, getting this message out to everybody. I think it's a very important message, and our individual and institutional success kind of depends on how good we are at teaching and learning.